wonderful the mind of a child.
What is this place?
A conduit through which the entire force...
Luminous beings are we, not this truth factor. Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
What you need, you already have. Unfortunately, you seem to be letting it all go.
I won't let him lose his way. Not like I did.
The future, by its nature, can be changed.
Here in this place, I can change things.
You don't know that.
Don't know that.
Go to the planet Tython. There's a chance a Jedi may sense his presence and come searching for him.
Don't you see?
You think that Kanan sent you here to help me? It's a
Pathway between all time and space.
My friends, like many, I was blown away by the season finale for The Mandalorian Season 2. But once the dust settled, I began to prepare to answer questions and break the season down, and I realized that something was off. Something big. Something that changes the entire narrative of canon as we understood it. I tried to write it off or find a way to explain it, since all the evidence seemed to point to a theory that I've been a large denier of. But I can't remain ignorant any longer. When all the evidence stares you in the face and refuses to back down, it's time to admit the truth. This is that truth. Today we look at The Mandalorian Season 2 and how it changed everything. To start, we need to look at the history of the galaxy according to the sequel trilogy and surrounding material. According to that historical account, it begins with Luke redeeming Vader in Return of the Jedi. Immediately after Endor, Luke begins training Leia, but he stops her training about a year after Endor when she has a vision that her training will lead to the death of her son. Luke promises that he will train Leia's son when he reaches the age of 10 and would spend the next 11 years preparing for that time. During that time, Luke focuses his energy on searching for Jedi temples and artifacts in order to be better prepared to open his own Jedi temple. He takes Ben after his 10th birthday and opens his own Jedi temple, which is about 6 years after the events of The Mandalorian. According to that history, Ben was Luke's first apprentice. After that, Snoke reaches out to Ben, yada yada, we all know the rest. Now, there are some very important ways that the sequel trilogy is connected to The Mandalorian. First, we know that the Empire in The Mandalorian wants Grogu for his blood, and that Dr. Pershing, a cloning expert, is in charge of this research. Furthermore, we know that Snoke is a strandcast, basically a completely bioengineered being, almost like a clone without a host. The experiments we see that were made from Grogu's blood in The Mandalorian Season 2 also happen to look an awful lot like Snoke. If it's true that Snoke is grown from Grogu's blood, then the Empire would have had to have successfully captured Grogu at some point and used his blood to make Snoke, since we know that by the time Grogu is rescued, they had not yet been successful in learning how to properly use his blood. The important thing about Grogu and the reason the Empire wants him is that he has a high M count, and we learn from the Rise of Skywalker novelization that it's almost impossible to produce a Force-sensitive clone or strandcast. The Empire was trying to take Grogu to learn how to transfer his Force sensitivity into a clone or strandcast. But this leads us to ask, where was Grogu during the sequels? Was he killed by Ben in the raid on Luke's Jedi Temple? Well, I suggest that Grogu is actually in Palpatine's possession in The Rise of Skywalker. We see in The Rise of Skywalker that Palpatine is continuing to grow Snoke's, implying that he still has access to the child's blood. But that begs the question, when did the Imperials get Grogu? Because I don't believe that the blood that they would have gotten from him before his rescue would have been enough to create that many Snoke clones. I suggest that that moment already happened, only in another timeline. A timeline where Ahsoka died. You see, if Ahsoka had died, no one would have sent the Mandalorian to Tython, but the Empire would have still caught up with him since he was already being tracked. Presuming that Mando still got his crew together to find Moff Gideon and that the rest of the events played out the same, this is where things would have changed.
You're about to face off with the Dark Troopers. You had your hands full with one. Let's see how you do against a platoon. Everyone in this room will be dead. But me and the child.
You see, if Ahsoka had not directed them to Tython, then the child wouldn't have called out through the Force. And then, if the child hadn't called out through the Force, Luke would not have answered Grogu's call. Mando and his crew would have gone to rescue Grogu, but here, at this moment, everyone would have died and Moff Gideon would be free to take the child. We know that even one Dark Trooper was overwhelming for this crew, and an entire platoon of them would have certainly been too much for them to handle. If it weren't for Luke, this would be where the Empire secured Grogu and kept him forever. See, I propose that the sequel era is a timeline where Ahsoka died. Luke never heard Grogu on Tython, and the Imperials kept the child. We know, for example, that in the old timeline, Luke didn't have any apprentices until Ben was 10 years old. But here, we see him take Grogu 6 years ahead of schedule, meaning that by the time Luke was ready to train Ben, he would have already had 6 years of practice, making him a better teacher more equipped to train Ben. Furthermore, if the Imperials didn't have enough of Grogu's blood, they wouldn't have been able to make Snoke. And without Snoke to whisper in Ben's ear, his descent to the dark side would have been seriously hampered. So when did this split of timelines happen? Well, the linchpin for all these events is here. In Season 4 of Star Wars Rebels, Ezra enters into a corner of the cosmic force and uses it to save Ahsoka from Darth Vader. It seems interesting to me that everything past Chapter 14 hinges on this change. Ahsoka is the linchpin. She is the thread holding all of this together, and without the actions of Ezra Bridger, Grogu would have been lost to the Empire, and the Mandalorian would be dead, and Luke wouldn't have trained anyone until Ben Solo reached the age of 10 years old. I find it interesting that Filoni and Favreau created a conclusion for the Mandalorian that depends on that linchpin, and then connected that conclusion with Luke. And they connected it in a way that directly contradicts the sequels, almost as if the sequels is what would have happened to Luke if Ahsoka had died. Almost like a warning, a what if. And this isn't without evidence either. There are several keys and clues that tell us that something is off. First, when Rey becomes all of the Jedi, we can hear the voices of several dead Jedi speaking to her, along with Ahsoka.
It guided you as it guided us.
Feel the Force flowing through you.
This stuck out to fans because we didn't know that Ahsoka had died, and if she didn't, she would be the only living Jedi to be speaking to Rey in this moment. Almost as if this scene takes place in a separate timeline. A timeline where Ahsoka did die 39 years ago. Second is the absence of Grogu in the sequels. Obviously, in our world or behind the scenes, he wasn't created yet, which is why he wouldn't be there, but that's why it's such an odd choice to send him with Luke, since we know what happens to Luke, or at least we thought we did. I was so sure that Grogu wouldn't go with Luke because Luke's story is already written. But what if Grogu changes that story? What if his path can change the events that we thought we knew? Next is something we mentioned before, but that was that Ben was Luke's first student, and that he waited until his 10th birthday to train him. As we said before, The Mandalorian takes place 6 years before that. Either this is a massive retcon, or these two events take place in alternate realities. One where Ahsoka died, and the other, Ahsoka lives. Finally, back when The Force Awakens was still new, it was revealed that Snoke had been an observer for the rise and fall of the Empire, but that he was a passive observer, while we learned in The Rise of Skywalker that he was himself created after the supposed death of Palpatine. However, if he was made from Grogu's blood, Grogu was someone who was a passive observer for both rise and fall of the Empire. From the beginning, I have been a massive skeptic of the sequel retcon theory. I just thought there was no way they'd use the world between worlds again. But as I've gathered evidence trying to answer these questions for you all, the more I do, the more I find myself unable to deny that the Mandalorians and the sequels really cancel each other out. I think it's not that they're going to retcon the sequels. I think they already did it. And it started when Filoni walked on stage all those years ago at Star Wars Celebration, wearing a shirt with the most critical reveal in canon. Ahsoka lives. But that is my take on this. Honestly, this theory is one that I've really been a large antagonist towards. It just felt too much like fan fiction. But the more I'm looking at the evidence and the more I'm looking at what's happening, the more I can't deny the sequels and The Mandalorian can't take place in the same timeline. There's just too much that cancels each other out, almost like Snoke's existence depends on Moff Gideon capturing the child and the Mandalorian dying. And that would be the logical course of action if Ahsoka hadn't been there to direct the Mandalorian to Tython. Almost as if these events have to take place in separate timelines. As unlikely as it is, I can't help but feel like this is actually the direction that they've decided to go. And I believe that it's actually possible that this may be explained in the Ahsoka series. We know that the Ahsoka series has a logo very reminiscent of the art style of the World Between Worlds. And maybe that's not telling us that they will use the World Between Worlds in that series, but maybe they will outright explain, or even show us what would have happened had the World Between Worlds not been used to save Ahsoka. It's reasonable to assume that if Ezra hadn't intervened, Ahsoka would have died there, and that this shot of Vader is a shot of a Vader who had just killed his apprentice. But all of that changed 4 years later when Ezra went back and saved Ahsoka. But I want to know what you guys think. Does everything hinge on the line, Ahsoka lives? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, because as always, I want to know what you, my friends, have to say about our favorite galaxy far, far away. And don't feel bad if you disagree with this, because honestly, this theory was really hard for me to swallow, and it took a lot for me to get here to the point where I am now sitting before you telling you that yes, I do think that this has happened. And it feels really weird, but here I am. So thank you all so much for watching and sitting through my crazy ramblings, but I am really excited to share this with you, and I cannot wait to hear what you, my friends, have to say about this. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for watching, and as always, may the lore be with you, now and forever.